Good evening and welcome. Tonight we have the pleasure of having all the way from Vancouver, Canada, Ian Wallace, who's going to talk on his photographic conceptual work. And that's all I'm going to say because he's going to talk about his work. Thank you very much for coming. By the way, there should be some time to have questions afterwards.
Thanks, Denise, and to the Architectural Association for inviting me to talk, and for everybody. I realize it's an important day for you today. It's the last day of term, I believe. So thank you for coming, and especially to those people who spent a day at the symposium at Live in Your Mind at Conway Hall. So I've got quite a few slides I'd like to show, but I'm going to keep my talk down to an hour, so I'll really keep an eye on it. And if I start to go over or whatever, just please let me know. Also, please interrupt me at any time if you have any question. I'm used to interruptions, and I don't mind interruptions. I can always get back on track. I've got a little outline of notes. So I don't know what you know about me, but I've been practicing as an artist, beginning with painting and mostly being involved with photographic practice, coming out of conceptual art for the most part, since the mid-'60s, so it's about 35 years of work. And the past 15 years especially have been incredibly productive years, very kind of large series and large exhibitions. So I have a body of work I couldn't possibly show you in an hour session. I'm doing an exhibition coming up in Brussels in mid-April that's about the photography of the city. It's an enlarged group exhibition that's featuring my work in a series that I did called Heroes in the Streets in particular. So as a way of kind of rehearsing this particular work in my own mind and reviewing it actually critically, I thought I would use that as the basic focus for today's talk here. It involves architecture mostly fairly indirectly. I have actually done a number of exhibitions that involve architecture specifically, but this work involves the city in a sense as an object, as a field, as a ground in which pedestrians, individuals, friends, personae kind of carry out a kind of everyday performance of the everyday, you might say. But I'm going to, in looking at this work, I'm going to consider mostly work only from 1986 to about 1992, but do a bit of reference back to some early photographic work I was doing in 1969 as a background, mostly for my own kind of questioning of where I was, the trajectory of my work, where I was coming from and what I'm going back to in effect. So if we could have the lights down, I'll give you... my work has been very rarely exhibited in London, so it's probably new to you. So I'll give you a bit of a description, technically first, of this work, beginning from the mid-'80s. This is the series, what I call the classic series of My Heroes in the Streets, which has a lot of, 10 very large canvases this big in this particular series alone. These canvases are 6 feet by 11 feet in scale. And a number of other diptychs, which we will see as we go through, and you'll see the exhibition installations of these works. Technically, the works beginning, this particular series beginning in 1986, 85, 86, involves the lamination of large-scale photo enlargements onto canvas ground. Just a quick technical description so that you know what you're looking at here. These are actual canvas stretched onto large frames in a typical kind of monochrome painting format, with the large photographs basically just taken from 35 millimeter snapshots, blown up and then laminated through a heat and pressure system right onto the canvas grain. Of course, there's a very kitsch technique that's used for doing kind of marriage and family style photography onto canvas grain, and it's somewhat related to that practice in terms of a technique. This is an I'm just introducing the work first here. This is an installation here of 3 of these pieces. We'll return back to this piece later to give you another idea. And this is another slightly smaller, earlier version before I did this larger series here. This, by the way, just because some of you know him, is Jeff Wall, who's one of my heroes in the streets of this particular series, walking amongst a movie lineup. I'll discuss the actual staging of these images as we proceed in the talk, but I'm just kind of giving you a first look at things. Here's two more examples of works from this series that take another kind of appearance. The one on the left here, called At the Crosswalk, who's the artist Rodney Graham and Kathleen Byrne. The images are 8 feet high and 16 feet wide. Each of the panels is 4 by 8 feet. And the panels, the canvas panels, are all separate, by the way, and just kind of put together in the formation that you see here. On the right-hand side is a series that involves in diptych format, where the subjects, my heroes in the streets, the individuals here as we see, but as I indicated, I'll return to this question of the personage or persona as we get into the talk. In this case, the modules, by the way, of 4 by 8 feet, this series has an imprint of plywood. Now, plywood is used here as well as all over the world as a standard building material. As architects, of course, you know that. And the standard size, at least in North America, European continental sizes are slightly different, but generally the same, of 4 by 8 feet. So this module, in effect, of 4 by 8 feet formed a kind of a scale module for the work as a whole, for this one as well as the one on the right-hand side. And I'm just giving you a first introduction to what the work looks like right now. So we'll get into discussing why these techniques, why these modules, why the subject as a whole as we get into it. And please interrupt me with any question if it pops into your mind at the moment. Now, I'd like to, without unduly kind of positioning myself in a kind of a hagiography of great art, even though I'm sorry to say, from my point of view, I think my work holds up. I don't think from a lot of other people's view necessarily, but we'll see. Time will tell, whether I'll hang next to Barnett Newman without being embarrassed or not. We'll see. But I'm going to refer to other artists' work not so much to kind of glorify my work in the proximity of artists that I think are great artists. And of course, not everybody thinks that Barnett Newman is a great artist, but I do, as a matter of fact. In any case, I learned, in appreciating and questioning and looking at other art by friends as well as by artists of the past, so I never could possibly know because they passed away many years ago. I, as an artist, learned to produce my own work from questions raised through other artists' work. Now, to refer first to Barnett Newman's work just a little bit in, say, relationship to, I don't know if, they only go forward, don't they? Oh, sorry, reverse. In relationship to, for instance, At the Crosswalk here, I was very, I mean, it's not a new discovery on my part, but it's something that I came to understand about Barnett Newman's work from my own sense. But the concept of the figure or the mark or the zip across his monochrome field stood as a kind of a sign for an idea of presence. And Barnett Newman's work is a metaphysical concept of presence. As a matter of fact, I think it is a kind of an idea of about the kind of triumphal sense of subjectivity, of pure subjectivity, of artistic statement, of artistic gesture. And Barnett Newman, I think it's probably the weaker side of his aesthetic, was, in a sense, very much self-conscious of himself as a great artist in the formation of a concept of essential meaning. And I was interested in this and of understanding this and how I could, in a sense, enfold this idea of the mark or the figure across a monochrome space, but in what I think of as a critical way, and it's in a mundane or prosaic sense, with the ordinary photograph. And putting, in a sense, an ordinary person who happens to be a friend of mine, and I think a great artist as well, for instance, Rodney Graham, also standing as the figure. And this brings up brought up for me and folds in for me and ideas about the concept of figure field as a function of how meaning is formed and how meaning is constructed within, not just within the painting, within the pictorial realm, within the linguistic realm, but and philosophical realm, but also in how we identify ourselves in the existential sense. And I'm not going to get too much into kind of woolly-headed existentialist philosophy, but how we identify as a self in the plenum of the urban landscape, in the plenum of all of the demands of modern contemporary society that's put on us that seem to dominate and overwhelm us as individuals. How do we surface as a self, as a figure in this plenum, in effect, and how can it be produced as an image or a representation? Now, another artist, to move on here, who provided a cue, in effect, for how my practice would take shape, was an artist who I was really interested in the mid-'60s, well, sort of the late '60s, actually, is Dan Graham. And another artist whose practice was quite similar to Dan Graham's at the time, and the use of photography as a kind of pseudo-journalism, was Robert Smithson. And of course, a number of other artists that came to light by the late '60s, such as Ed Ruscha and Douglas Hubler, et cetera, and a number of the artists that are in the Live in Your Head show at Whitechapel as well, of course, were using the photograph of the everyday, in effect, as a kind of a pseudo-journalism, as a kind of photojournalism, as a kind of a marking, a registration, a referent to various kinds of either kind of procedural methods in approaching, perceptual objects. For instance, I think of John Hilliard's work with the photograph documenting its own condition, for instance, in the Live in Your Head show, and other phenomena. So this wasn't an absolutely unique phenomenon. It was kind of something that was kind of found itself in a lot of, you might say, in the conceptual developments of late modernism in the late '60s, but expressed in photographic technique. Now, this was important to me because from 1967 to '68, '69, I was doing monochrome paintings. But I was very caught up in, of course, the general involvement with, as an artist, wanting to make some kind of significant or meaningful statement in terms of the political mood of the times. How could one, as an abstract, minimal modernist, make a significant statement within the demands, you might say, the social demands of the period and of the present, as a matter of fact. So photography seemed to be the way to do it. Now, how do you do it in photography other than to be a photojournalist? Because I was still caught up in, you might say, the ideality of the idea of art, especially in the influences on my art from such artists as Barnett Newman, of course, and Ad Reinhardt as a monochrome artist. Now I'm going to show you some of my monochromes and then how I shifted from monochrome into photography through very specific strategies. Now, one of these strategies, as I'm going to show, and since I don't want to keep reversing the slides, was what I found in Dan Graham's work, for instance, and it appears in his images of suburban housing on Staten Island here, in his famous piece called Homes for America, done in, which was a kind of a pseudo-architectural, pseudo-real estate journalistic piece published in Arts Magazine in the winter of '66, '67, is that the row housing here formed a kind of visual analog to, for instance, as I saw it, the modular sculpture of Don Judd. And this, for me, provided the clue as to how I could, in a sense, unfold some of the formal structural prototypes or models, in a sense, for a certain kind of avant-garde modernism, avant-garde late modernism, and then retrieve those models, in a sense, from the everyday landscape, the social landscape, through photography. Now, the early years I was doing this was very tentative, as we'll see, but it moved on and was developed in subsequent years, as I'll show during the talk. This is an example of some of the early monochromes I did in 1967, '68. Of course, this monochrome painting was, in a sense, the end game of abstraction, the end game of modernism, as a matter of fact. And as an artist, and I was 24 years old in 1967, as an artist, even though I felt I was doing something important, in a very provincial way, actually, because in Vancouver I was pretty well one of the only artists at that time who was doing a non-gestural, reductive, minimalist monochrome painting. So at least in that provincial, rather isolated context of Vancouver, which actually had some pretty sophisticated discourse going on, but it was still, by comparisons with other large cities like London and New York, obviously isolated and provincial. And so as a young artist, 24 years old, it's a little bit precocious, a little bit arrogant, I suppose, and felt that I was doing something important. But then I had to say what was important about this, and why should it be important, and what was my own future in this? Like, how could I keep producing the end game of, you might say, the closed out picture space? So in fact, the installation photograph we have here on the right-hand side, this piece is about 7 feet by 2 feet. It was put next to the exit sign in the back hallway. I did an exhibition in one of the universities in Vancouver, but instead of showing the exhibition space, I hung all my works in the hallways and in the back hallways, so the people had to go through the back corridors and the rear exits to see the work. In effect, it was a little bit of a joke on the idea of endgame monochrome, late modernism, in effect, and that particular installation shot kind of, for me, still picks up on that joke a little bit. Many of these paintings were destroyed subsequently when I turned away from the monochrome. Of course, even though I showed in a few in Vancouver, a few local, fairly prestigious shows, there was no market for this work. It wasn't a question that somebody's going to buy it. And in my rather limited view of those possibilities, never thought that they would be used. Actually, I gave some of the canvases to my brother, who was also a painter. He turned them on his side. He was living in the far north in the Yukon at the time, and did some dog sled paintings on it because the format allowed itself. So there's a bit of that's what happens to endgame modernism that goes that direction. But as it is, these two paintings still exist. They still survive. And I do have a few that survive. Now, just to kind of touch on this shift, in effect, from monochrome to photography, this is one of my monochrome paintings sitting on the floor in my studio in 1968, I think this was. The view from my studio window is the view that we see in this. It's a framed photograph of two photographs. Here, looking down at the busy intersection, I had my studio in a high 6th floor, I think, of a old downtown office building. Looking down, what I was interested in here was, again, coming from the Dan Graham photograph I showed you about the kind of the model of John Judd's sculpture, modular sculpture format, kind of model for how it can be appropriated into photography. I looked at the crosswalk here and really picked up on the idea of the crosswalk as related to my interest in the limits of the frame. I was very interested in the discourse of late modernist formalism and the idea of the pictorial limits and, of course, the limits of picture space as a framing device for a concept. And so what I did was this became, the source or kind of an idea about metaphor, about that idea of framing, but of course located in the visual facticity, the punctum of the photograph, in effect. And what happens, of course, in the photograph, in the actual site and in the photograph, is the passage, you might say, of the urban subject, both technological, in the case of automobiles and electronic signage, allowing people to cross the street, and the people in the street. So then, from that, I started to find my subject and started to use that metaphor as the research or the main model in my subject. Here's the same yellow painting we saw sitting on the floor of my studio. This is where it was exhibited in the university exhibition. And one of the photographs, I've always, not always, but in many cases, my subjects, in effect, are very close to where I work. So this is just literally the street corner. I didn't need to go far. This is a street corner just below my studio. Just go down into the street and take pictures on the street corner, just photographing people standing there fairly randomly. In this case, kind of composing so that the rectangle from a normal standing position, the rectangle of the crosswalk, it's a little difficult to see here, stands out as a kind of form, in effect, in the visual image of the photograph. Now, there's, in the attitude about photography, at least here now, the framing device becomes, in a sense, a means or a hook on which other kinds of subject matter begin to enter the picture, including questions about architecture, questions about mobility, transience, identity, the individual, the figure, the human figure in this particular case. What enters in here, as I saw it, is a kind of beginning of a kind of very tentative dramatization of the subject within a framework of a formal structural point of view of the city. And I was very interested in that subject. But at this point, these subjects are still quite anonymous. In late 1970, I moved to London, and this is a picture from London in 1970. I don't know what street it is, around Camden Town somewhere, I think. And on the right-hand side, it's a photograph from, again, just the street sidewalk just below my studio in Vancouver. Now, I show these two at this point. What I was interested in was this idea of using various kind of, is the microphone kind of loud? Not too loud? I thought I heard a bit of echo. Of the, for instance, bits of architectural furniture of the street, for instance, in a sense, almost like a montage of the figure and the street. I was interested in these kind of compressions of space. Other photographers at the time did that as well. I think of the American photographer Lee Friedlander, for instance, and Robert Frank, who they're kind of apparently fortuitous juxtapositions of figure, field, foreground, background, always kind of played ironically with the relation of a subject and the field in which the subject was finding themselves, often quite playfully, for instance. I was trying to be not too playful. It was a bit of the severeness of the conceptual methodology was to be a little bit more rigorous in your approach to playing with the camera. As a matter of fact, about that I should emphasize too, is I never thought of myself as a photographer here. It was only the camera was only a means of appropriating the world, in effect, as a ready-made, in effect. That the world was only appropriated in to be reflected upon, to be observed, not for aesthetic purposes, but as much for, you might say, a critique of aesthetic ideality, a critique of that ideality of Barnett Newman that I mentioned before, that ideal meaning, that ideal coherent, unified, triumphant subjectivity, so to speak, that apparently desire for triumphant subjectivity, the triumphant self, so to speak, to be brought into conflict with the reality, so to speak, of the everyday world, which of course is dominated by the various kind of technical forms and structural, superstructural, architectural forms of high capitalism. Of course, I was at this time I think in a fairly undisciplined way, but still in an intentional way of being involved with the kind of Marxist critique of reality through the photograph at this time. In these photographs, I was interested in this idea of like the real versus the virtual, of the interest in the store window commodity and the reflection of an individual in the store window imagery in kind of mirror reflections. And I did quite a few pieces that involve this kind of relationship to reflections in the store window, and I'll go on to show you this a little bit too. A little bit later, the artist Dan Graham also picked up on this. I was aware of his earlier work, but he wasn't aware of my work at all until much later. Another example here, the blue monochrome we saw hanging by the exit sign earlier, a more recent photograph of it, and a piece called Street Reflections. These early photo pieces were very simple, just snapshots blown up. In this case, each image is 16 by 20 inches, and just put into a very structural arrangement on the wall in some way that seems to accent form, in effect. In this case, the verticality and the split between the real and the virtual in these reflected image spaces. How's our time going? Not too fast. I should go faster. But another two details again from this same piece called Street Reflections from 1970. Street Reflections is from 1970. And a piece I did in London in 1970 as well, called Pan Am Scan, which was just shot on Oxford Street, right across from the Royal Academy, right here, Burlington House. And it was, at that time, the Pan American ticket office. I went by looking for it a while ago, and it wasn't, it's changed, it's moved. In any case, I panned from the window of the ticket office just across the space out into the pedestrians in the street. The compositional motif of the buttress of the building, as a matter of fact, here, the pillar of the building, is one that reappears later on in my monochromes, as a matter of fact. This kind of empty space, I really liked this, in this particular photograph, this empty space here, this idea that there's just a kind of pure space with no particular signifier in it. And as a matter of fact, there's an elderly gentleman kind of slightly awkwardly struggling out the door, and you see his foot exit right here. I like this guy compressed in the space here, and then these two figures on this side. By the way, in 1968, I studied art history and I've taught art history for 30 years, and my thesis was on the early work of Mondrian. So I was very interested in the idea of composition and dynamic equilibrium, of course, which is a part of the compositional conceptual method, or subject of Mondrian's work, the feeling in his work. And even though I wasn't specifically composing for this, it comes out in my work, this image, this way that figures, for instance, are awkwardly kind of walk off the edge or are compressed in the residual space of a photographic space, for instance, has always interested me, and it's kind of, I think, functioned as a bit of a expressionistic motif in my work. Certain kind of expression of an idea about tension and oppression that can exist in the modern city. One that when we do move in the city, we kind of transcend, we accept it, we live through it and overcome it in effect, but it's still there. It's kind of hems our bodies in and makes us very aware of our own limits in space, in effect. And I'm always kind of interested how this can also be reflected in compositional motifs in works of art. The interest in certain kind of confusion, in this case of, as modern critiques would have it, confusion of commodity products. But I was also, when I was actually just photographing, it's kind of a wall of brassieres and mannequins here with in a kind of a discount store with a window, with a mirror up above. I like this complete plenum of confusion that exists in this type of space. It's absolutely hysterical in terms of like all of these objects around you. But this woman was kind of came up in front of me in the photograph with her dark glasses. And she just kind of became a hero, an anonymous hero in my work. And then in this, I really like the strange horn-like kind of curls on this woman's head. And then this headless kind of mannequin advertising a sweater. It's just like aspects of these pictures and these photographs, which is it occurs accidentally at random, in effect. I didn't look for this in the picture. It occurs randomly in photographic space and in photographic images, which gives the photographic images their potency, in effect. It's not something I impose on the material. It's something that the camera allows, or the photograph allows me to draw out of the given world as a ready-made, in effect, and then fold it into my own particular discourse, which sometimes goes on various tangents. Another piece I thought I'd show this time, I've never shown it before, is this one I did in London again in maybe early 70s, 71, of these two, I think of them as kind of working class heroes walking down the street. I was actually at the time photographing the street. I was interested in all the lines and the dots. The street is a kind of a formal kind of motif. But these two guys came walking down the street, and here's the next two in the series of three. There's a kind of a beautiful ballet of synchronized movement as they come towards me in the camera here. And then this one guy who's carrying a wrench kind of looks up at me out of the corner of his eye, a little bit suspiciously because I had a camera in my hand. So for me, this photograph, it's minor work, but it has for me a kind of interest in latent subjects that exist in the possibility of this. So I guess the main thing I'm kind of identifying is that even though on the surface of things my methodology was fundamentally kind of formal, structured through kind of formal abstract concerns, the latent residual content of the everyday world, or the real, kind of surfaces up in front of this formal structure and becomes the subject. So again, indirectly, rather not choreographed by myself at all, but just the way things happen, these figures become my heroes in ironic brackets, in effect. Any questions at this point? I'm just going to do a slight shift in the discussion now. No? I'm trying to leave a little bit of time for discussion at the end, but we'll keep it moving. The next phase of my work involves what I call syntax, or sequence photography, or kind of quasi-cinematic techniques. Now, this partly came from what we just saw, this time-lapse photography, or using the camera almost like a movie camera, in effect, catching instances of movement, the idea of mobility, transience, flux, almost in a futurist sense, the flow, to use the more recent terms, flows of information, in effect, flows of events in everyday reality, and then represented or represented in a image, in a work, a coherent work. I was also had a kind of a parallel practice beginning in the late 70s. I guess the first piece I did was 1969, 1970, of what I call magazine pieces, which was sort of somewhat influenced, I think, by work I'd seen by Joseph Kosuth and Lawrence Weiner, even though I don't know really where it came from. Or Carl Andre, perhaps, even. Carl Andre's use of kind of identical modules kind of laid out on the floor. And I actually got to know Carl Andre at this time, so I was quite aware of his work. In the magazine pieces, it was front cover plus all facing pages of a magazine laid out on the wall in a given format until exhausted, which is a show actually I did at Genesta in London here about 3 years ago. And this is a 1971 17 magazine, and this is a wallpaper magazine from the show in London in 1971. Now, what I was interested in this particular work was, A, the ability to make work on the run, in effect, real arte povera, because I could do a very, very large-scale painting, for exhibition purposes, that only, in this case, 17 magazine only cost like 50 cents, plus some tape and a stapler, and I could have the whole thing on the wall. And again, like the photograph, in a sense, which appropriates the world as an everyday, I've appropriated, in a sense, the media of the magazine as the everyday, which also speaks to its own content, like the photography I was using. Now, this content was not meant for me, like as though I invented it. It's not an original piece, so it wasn't even my interest. But it was to say, this is what happens when we take a magazine, say about Glamour, 17 magazine, and lay it out. Now, all of the latent content of what the psychic subjectivity of everyday modern life is, and the superstructural level, is implicit in this magazine. We can understand it and read it. By deconstructing the magazine and reconstructing it as a cultural artifact, the magazine, in effect, reveals the latent subject matter that exists in everyday life of, you might say, the superstructure, to put it in rather vulgar terms, but just one side of the page, yeah. Just the, yeah, exactly. But it's all the same anyways. As a matter of fact, it's a completely arbitrary scheme because it can be any magazine. So far, there's only one person that's bought the work, but it is for sale. There's only one person that's bought the work, and that person can show the work in any form they want, at any time they want. So there's no authorship. As a matter of fact, anybody can do it, as far as I'm concerned. And they don't even need to buy it. It doesn't really matter to me. It's a bit like Lawrence Weiner's work that exists in the public domain, because 1/3 of his work exists in public domain. Anybody can make it. Right? So, in any case, what these works offered to me was the image of an idea of syntax, of kind of a narrative flow that exists on the wall and yet form a coherent work at the same time. Because I was using, and this is important to me, because I was using photography, beginning to use photography in this narrative way, not just in terms of syntax pieces that I just showed you earlier, but in terms of montage, like a cinematic techniques of montage, using you might call autonomous photographs, but put together in such a way that the subject matter, in other words, I begin to impose a little bit of my own reading on it at this point through the editing process of opening up discussions about the subject matter in this. These are all, well, this is an untitled works. I did quite a few of these snapshots that were blown up to 30 by 40 inches, which at that time was sort of about the largest standard photographic enlargement you can do in 1970, 71 was 30 by 40 inches. And this was of a kind of a partisan party in Vancouver had occupied huge area of real estate that was going to be turned into a big apartment and hotel complex and block the development. So this was an example of a kind of utopian radical leftism that was, in a sense, commandeering kind of certain and interfering and interrupting in certain property relations, which is, of course, represented by the apartment blocks in the background. The top is actually shot in the underground in London, I think, as you'd recognize quite immediately, with a kind of the businessmen, and the London businessmen still look like this, you know, and still carrying the briefcase and kind of walking rather hurriedly through the tube. I was in the rush hour, caught in the rush hour the other day in Waterloo Station. I saw them all around me. But in this case, that was it is again circumstantial. I realized it was a Patton poster, which was all about kind of macho militarism. Is this kind of like flashing off his genitals at the front end. That was a bit of my reading of this at the time. It's a bit trite now in retrospect, a bit of humor, but I was kind of starting to loosen up my rigorous conceptual approaches and conceptual method, I think, stimulated by what I saw as the kind of the promising ability of the readability of the photograph. Of course, at this time, there was the surfacing of an interest in what is now seems passé, but an interest in semiotics, and particularly, say, in the readings of Roland Barthes, who wrote I only saw it in 1973, was his famous essay called The Third Meaning, which was, in a sense, really all about reading into the texture of the photograph, past the sign, past the symbol, reading into the texture of meaning that exists in photographic space. This is a piece, again, using a number of photographs taken at different instances, just about different kind of a hierarchy of architecture, from cultural corporate architecture of the Winnipeg Art Gallery with a big crowd in the street, to domestic architecture, to a squatting house on the right-hand side in the mudflats in Vancouver, where I happened to be living at the time. So I was kind of like a, artistically ambitious radical leftist hippie living in a squatting development, who was kind of trying to use the camera to kind of agitate and intervene in the dominant forces of high capitalist society. Highly idealistic, and why not? Here's some details of the same pictures again, and I'll pass on because we're running out of time. Might not even finish. Now, in the left-hand projectors a bit. Thank you very much, John. Joe, is it? Yeah. Joe, thanks. Now, beginning in 1972, after Melancholie de la Rue, that was the first serious exhibition I did of that Melancholie de la Rue. It was actually at Arc in Paris, the Musée de l'Art Moderne de la Ville de Paris, was shown in a group show there. So for me, it was like, wow, I can go somewhere with this. So I continued to develop this idea of the narrative structure of the large-scale photographic blow-up in a quasi-cinematic sequence. In the summer of 1973, Jeff Wall, who was living in London at the time, had come back to Vancouver, and Rodney Graham and himself and myself worked on a film called the Summer Script. The film was never completed. It was a bit of a fiasco in the end. But from the video residues of this film, I rescued a piece called Summer Script, of which I printed and blew up this very, very large series, and it began my 70s work, basically, which was based upon these very large-scale spectacle, quasi-cinematic pieces. Each of the segments in the photograph is 6 feet by 4 feet, so the whole piece is about 70 feet long. This one here is called An Attack on Literature, very, very much into a kind of a symbolist performance about writing and the problems of writing and frustration with scripting, in effect, which I think came out of the first one, was done in 1975. But I'm passing through this because this is, I'm just showing you what happened in the interval. Now, and it's important mostly insofar as that this work kind of reintroduced a kind of narrativity into my more facticity-oriented street photography, which I return to. You'll see that in a second. This is Lookout, and this is 48 feet long. And this is another one series on the right-hand side from 1980 called Poverty, which involved the return of monochrome painting. Came back into my work. Of course, the return of painting became an issue in the late 70s, early 80s for conceptual artists and for art in general. But using a kind of Warhol technique, I silk-screened stills from a film that I'd made about transients. It's called Poverty, but it's actually more about the idea of the homeless or transients. A kind of little bit image of urban refugees or something like that. And in some ways, it was a bit of a play on the idea of homeless representation, but that was not significant to it. And I took stills off a 16 millimeter film I made, and that formed the basis of the piece called Poverty, as we see on the right-hand side here. I show it to you just because it involves a certain kind of, the idea of visual spectacle, a return to the theme of the street, but also the return of the medium of painting to my work. Because through all the earlier period of the 70s, I hadn't practiced any painting whatsoever. Here's a detail from one of the Poverty series on the left-hand side from 1980. I did a number of kind of versions of this in the years from 1980 to 85. And then 85, picking up on this theme, which I felt the weakness of this piece, that it was in effect, the imagery was, well, some people thought it was too romantic, which is acceptable criticism. But for me, the weakness is it wasn't direct. It was already mediated by history, by the history of social photography, the history of imagery of the dispossessed, et cetera, that exists particularly in the genres of the dispossessed in 19th century photography. Charles Neg, for instance, a classic example of it. But I felt that the mediation of it, which was a very postmodern development that, in my work, I would say had taken very, what we call classic postmodern developments in the 70s, I began to react against that and wanted to get back to this kind of like engagement with the real and the actual, and not with the symbol or the mediation of the symbol. And so when I did my Heroes in the Street series, as we're going to start looking at now, I just decided, okay, I'm still going to have the narrative persona like I had in other pieces. Like I'll just back up to, I think this one on the left, Lookout here, in which, I had photographed a number of friends of mine in my studio, and then photographed a landscape, collaged the images onto the landscape, and blew it up. None of these people had ever been in this particular landscape space. So it was highly synthetic, you might say. But what I wanted to do was take the idea of the, depicting a person who I knew, in effect, and putting them back into real space, the real urban space that I lived in the everyday. As a matter of fact, the picture on the right-hand side, which we'll return to at the end of the talk, as a matter of fact, it was shot right below where I was living at the time, and it was a friend who lived just below me going across the street to buy smokes and just walking back again. So it was a very simple, very, very everyday situation. But for me, of course, it's a little bit, dramatized by the evening light that she's caught in as she's crossing the street, and the buildings in the background, of course. So there are definitely some kind of dramatic, narrativized features in this that isn't just about the real thing. Back to the Heroes in the Streets. Here's this series again that we saw one of the very first slides. Just how are we doing for time? Coming very much up to the end of it. Seeing both sides. I wanted to emphasize that these, in fact, are paintings, and a picture of myself painting these paintings. I was very much into, in returning to painting, into actual brushwork, not rolling it on or spraying it on, but really dealing with just the pedestrian effort of actually painting the surface and dealing with that. This is the same series in an opening on the right-hand side in Montreal in 1987. And the Heroes in the Streets. There's, it's a part of a very large series, and they go together in sets. Like this is all one part of the set, and it's been, so far, this set has been sold, it's in a collection. The second set is not in a collection, but it actually goes together as a set of 3, and then there's 4 more in this particular series that form another 2 sets of 2. But they were very rigorously composed using the center point of the canvas as a model. In this case, the photograph is all to the left. In this case, the photograph, there's a buttress of a building intersects here, which formed the motif to shift it toward the center, and this one is set to the right. So I was using fairly rigorous kind of compositional strategies to unify the sets as a whole here. But unless you have any questions, I'll buzz through them quite quickly. Here's the other 2. All they are is just only painted white on the surface with a photograph laminated on the surface. And here's 2 more in the next subsequent set. I include, just as a reference here, the Voice of Fire by Barnett Newman that's in the National Gallery of in Ottawa in Canada, as a kind of reference, this idea of the compositional space of the photograph as the, you might say, the signifying figure that cuts across the plenum of the monochrome field, just as Barnett Newman made his zip, as I understand it, signifying the figure of presence, so to speak, or subjective presence against the field of the plenum, in effect. And in this case, there's a viewer in the gallery. I didn't take this photograph. It was just a copy photograph from a postcard. Maybe I shouldn't spend too much time on this, but just some references. I had seen in 1981 in the Westkunst show in Cologne. I don't know if anybody else saw that. Very, very important show. For the first time, I'd seen Warhol's diptych monochrome and image diptychs with the electric chair and the monochrome on the right-hand side. That was, for me, even though I'd already done Poverty, where I was trying to combine the monochrome with the image by then, this brought up this idea of the diptych, of the image, non-image. I was also very much steeped at that time in reading Frankfurt School and Adorno and Adorno's critique of identity and non-identity, etc. But I was also thinking about the concept of photograph as a ready-made. And where did the ready-made begin? One of the single most important artistic strategies or techniques of the 20th century. And Picasso's collages and Braque's collages, but particularly Picasso's collages for me of 1912 are absolutely key to this. They are the fountainhead of I would say most of important 20th century art comes from these crummy little paper collages that were at that time, I think, perhaps not meant to be anything at all except as experiments in how to see, just the way I thought of my early photographs as being. The ready-made, in this case, or the collages of Picasso, in this case, I see as the appropriated object from the everyday world, the newspaper in this case, and folded in. It preceded Duchamp's ready-mades by 1 year. So I think Duchamp, as I see it anyways, I could be wrong, really picked up on this and then did the wheel, did the urinal, etc. Well, the urinal was later, 1917. But the concept of the Duchamp ready-made, I think, came from Picasso's collages. Of course, the other side of Picasso went on to influence people like Mondrian and Malevich as well, and Tatlin. So it went in a number of different directions from these measly little, but in my mind, very, very beautiful collages. Now, of course, stimulated by this, here's a large drawing. I've also done, this is a bit of a slight tangent, but these kind of wood print photographic laminated drawings, in this case of a construction worker that I could see from my kitchen window in an apartment building that was being built next door in Vancouver, going over his plans. And almost like an artist will go over, idea for a work and be prepared to make the work. Of course, the other thing that's important in this imagery for me here, the material effect of the image is the use of plywood as basic construction material, mostly for pouring concrete forms, but also for siding as well. And I started at this time to use plywood imprints, plywood monoprints in my work. Another work that really stunned me when I first saw it is a 1962 painting by Don Judd when he was a painter. It was a thick kind of oil surface, but he sunk a baking pan in the center. It's something that you don't see very often in reproductions, but it's really, I think, the beginning of Judd's use of his later industrial modeled sculptures. And of course, this is from the Saatchi collection. I photographed this about 1989. Of an installation of Judd's plywood pieces, which was another referent for me. But the baking pan is, for me, really makes me realize how much Judd's work itself also refers to the appropriated object from the everyday industrial world, the ready-made, that brought up as a kind of a formal signifier of an actual production practice, which I was interested in. Now that image of the imprint, or of the baking pan, and the plywood and the construction, and a little bit of a glorification of the heroic worker working on, the construction worker as artist, you might say. A bit of a leftist fantasy, I suppose. But led on to these pieces here, these imprint pieces where the 4x8 sheets of plywood were imprinted onto canvas, along with a photograph, again, Friends in the Street and various kind of dramatized series, Caught in Traffic, et cetera, et cetera. I'm running out of steam a little bit here, and we've got lots of slides to go, so we won't finish today, but I'll go on a little bit longer. I think we've gone an hour already. Just a New York City #2 from 1942 to 44 by Piet Mondrian. Again, it's a Mondrian that's not well known. It's in the Westphalen Museum in Düsseldorf. Is that what it's called? In any case, in this case, it's actual tapes. It's a bit painted. The tapes are painted, but the tapes are still glued. It's an unfinished work by Mondrian. I really like that. I like that, tactile immediacy of the fact that Mondrian has applied a ready-made material to the front of his painting. But also the relevance to this for me is the compositional dynamics of it that picks up on the agitation, might say the intensity of urban life, particularly after his moving to New York City. The classical calm of his earlier abstract paintings from Paris in the 1930s now becomes more intense with Broadway Boogie Woogie, Victory Boogie Woogie. But for me, his New York City series, New York City 1, New York City 2, are as a series of works making a certain proposal about, in formal terms, about the tension of the urban landscape, for me, struck me as being, I think they're incredibly beautiful and moving works. And I suppose in my choosing of photographs, the taxi whizzing by, the verticality, the image one way, and of course One Way Street by Walter Benjamin for me is one of the references I use in this, or think of it anyways. The city in the background, this person standing here, Lisa Lemieux is an artist who's a friend, standing with her fists kind of clenched, kind of a little bit nervous from the traffic. All of these kind of psychic compositional elements of compression of the body in urban space for me was a part of the meaning of the work. Just picking up on this theme again, and I can move quite quickly now actually, because I've got some repetitions of slides. Here's some more images, again, of half-finished architecture with the person preparing to cross the street, but traffic is intervening. But in these pictures, I've sliced the photograph in half and put it on each side of a large scale canvas. As we see, this is 8 feet by 5 feet. No, sorry, 7.5 feet by 5 feet each side, so it's 80 inches by 60 inches each, so it's 10 feet across and 80 inches high. But I was interested again in this detailing of the construction site, and I've got quite a few pieces about construction site. I think there's a bit of, you might say, expressionistic motifs creeping in here. Images of, in installation art, there was like the scatter art thing was happening, Katie Nolan's work, and of course, Jonathan Borofsky, I saw his Polar Cooper show in 1981, where he kind of just threw pieces of crumpled paper all over the floor and had sculpture all over the place. Not exactly new, but at that time it was a bit shocking, that kind of installation. And I think I was sort of interested in the expressionistic, the idea of the disheveled, ruined, kind of slightly shattered image of the glossy surface of high capitalist architecture and everyday life. And I was kind of, I was kind of already well past punk at this time, But, a little bit of the interruptions of kind of glossy surface that come with punk aesthetics, I think were sort of latent in imagery like this. Jeff Wall had done, of course, a great punk piece called Destroyed Room that was kind of a little bit like this in feeling, I suppose. This is details showing the imprint of the monoprint of the canvas, and another one. Right. And details of this. What I was interested in, partly in this work, was the glossy image of the retro modern building here, kind of like kind of New York hotel style, but just done 10 years ago in Vancouver. But the building in a kind of a image of kind of half construction. It looks like a ruins in effect. I always did like that idea of Robert Smith's, and that like construction sites were like ruins in reverse. That it had a similar kind of aesthetic of dishevelment and incompletion. Another series somewhat similar, and I'm going to go very quickly through this, again with a split photograph, but similar themes. So this is an installation in Cologne. This is Robert Klein, an architect friend of mine who practices in Detroit and Windsor, Ontario here, standing outside his office. But we're running out of time, so I'm not going to dwell on this section. Here's another series of the large diptychs called the Saint-Étienne series. It was in a solo show I did in Saint-Étienne back in 1989, more than 10 years ago now, which had these large 8 foot by 8 foot. Of course, 2 4 by 8 panels makes 8 by 8 feet on either side. And another street series that I'm not showing you, but it's just in the background here, is a series based upon Heroes in the Streets, but it was done in Brussels in 1989. It was of immigrant Moroccan kids that had a kind of fenced-off playground in the boulevard just outside the gallery, and I photographed them playing football just outside the gallery and then showed the pictures inside the gallery. So it was a direct reference to what was happening outside. So that was kind of a tangential piece that exists in that particular show. Here's details of this, these diptychs from the Saint-Étienne series. The one on the left is a bit dark. There. You also see again here, wherever I could, I started to find sites that had half-constructed buildings with that image of problematic feature, I suppose. I should say, though, I don't think I indicated, on these Heroes and Streets, the figures weren't randomly there. It is dramatized to the point in the sense that I asked my friend to just cross the street back and forth, and I just took pictures. And then out of a roll of film, I would find one that was half decent. Not really staged, but you might say half staged. And pictures were always taken at the moment, when the person had to focus on crossing the street and not focus on being photographed. My idea was always to try and find a person in the middle of some everyday act, in effect, so that they would be most themselves, not a subject for the image, but a subject for themselves. Pardon? 35, yeah. You can see grain, but for me, the grain of the film itself actually matches the grain of canvas that it's on. So it actually works quite well. But I do even prefer 4x5. There's a kind of silkiness of this image in 4x5 that comes into conflict with the grain of the canvas that it's on, and actually has. But I use 4x5 mostly for my studio series, which is a whole other subject again. Like, we're only seeing one slice of my work here, one particular theme. And I had 3 themes I was working with. I didn't mention was studio, museum, and street, as 3 sites, in effect, for a certain kind of dramaturgy of modern life. The studio is like the interior space, the workspace, the production space of my own thought, showing the working instruments, et cetera, and I do a hotel series. When I travel, I work in hotel rooms and photograph that and do smaller works with that. The museum, which is like the cultural space that mediates between, you might say, the street and the studio, that brings, you might say, public space into conjunction with private space of production of works of art, is the museum. And I have a whole series of works based upon the museum, which, because 2 other very good artists concentrate on museum as a theme, I've let that go a little bit. And the street, which of course for me symbolizes the theater of public life, in effect, and all the subjects of that. This is the last 2 slides to close out here, just to return to this image from 1986 of my friend Wendy crossing the street. Wendy Elliott, who's an artist that currently lives in Dublin, Ireland, and went to Goldsmith College here in London, actually, for a few years in the early 90s. And she just, by coincidence, is staying in my apartment in Vancouver. She's come back to Vancouver after being away for some time. And just before I came here, I photographed her crossing the street again. So just as a little closing out between the original picture of her going across for some smokes and walking back, and today the same person just walking across the street to the little grocery store and buy some smokes and walking back. But of course this time, that time as well, now she's re-dramatizing or re-representing an image to construct an image of self as my hero in the street again after 10 years, 15 years now, so almost 15 years later. So it's kind of I don't know what that means. I can't do a meta critique on that. I don't know what it means, but it's kind of a nice thing that you take a picture of somebody that becomes an icon or emblem, and this picture here on the left has been reproduced a number of times. As a matter of fact, I gave it to the publicity people here where it was reproduced in the little catalog, and then that iconic image then being recaptured and replayed in effect as a contemporary image just of last week. So there you have it. So thank you very much for your attention. I'm open to any questions. Yes, sir.
Are you more interested in the European or the formal qualities and very particularly particularly formal qualities in photographs or to actually take the narratives, to formulate their own narratives, their own sub-narratives? Is there a difference to either one of the two?
Well, no. Ideally, they come together. Like I think, I'm a bit of a I like the idea of the classical unity of form and content. What the subject is about is also has a quality of form about it that enhances the subject or meets the subject or sometimes even comes into conflict with the subject, but the two kind of work together in a way that they support each other. Because every representation has a medium through which the representation is carried. That medium has material and formal qualities. And also I think our everybody's aesthetic sensibility, we all like certain things and don't like other things. And the things that we like, our eyes rest upon and play with and fantasize and whatever, those are its formal qualities. The subject matter, like the philosophical, personal themes that exist in it, I like to see enhance that or meet that interest in pure aesthetic sensation, you might say. In other words, what we like. Or be interested in. Even, like Don Judd said, art only needs to be interesting in effect. It's just what captures our interest. My work need not captures anybody's interest. But what I like to see people take away from it is both certain fascination with subject matter, even technique. Like a number of artists kind of look. You can always tell an artist in a museum, they look behind the paintings. They try to see how it was stretched, how it was framed, They want to get into how it was actually done. Those types of things I think are important as well. Form is like the beat in a song. The image is like the lyrics that kind of rides on the beat, you might say. The two ideally come together. I don't know if that answers your question appropriately.
I guess it does. I mean, I think there's a different process that architects have as far as the formal content isn't overriding. I don't think there is as much emphasis on picking up the minutiae of detail of formal qualities or the pattern of
Right.
formal textures in that way. So I mean, it's probably a reflection of different
Yeah.
approaches.
Well, there's obviously in architecture a different type of limit than the visual arts have. Say, I deal with what I call wall art. It's usually two-dimensional. So I can't work with three-dimensional space. And I can if I wanted to, but I don't. I choose to limit myself like an architect. Certain architects have attempted to add symbolic effects. In other words, content signs to the surface of the work, to the surface of architecture, sometimes to good effect, other times, especially in some much bad postmodern architecture, to bad effect. But I see architects don't quite have the flexibility with imagery that contemporary artists do. But in fact, the techniques now of contemporary signage and imagery, I don't see why architects can't build signage and imagery into the buildings themselves. There's a very interesting contemporary photographer, Bates Stroily, who does these very large photo-transparent imagery of people in the street. I very much am interested in his work. I think he does what I wish I was doing sometimes. I think he does great work. But he fills images of windows now. This is only recent work of his. Images in the windows that I think architects can consider work like that and be interested in. I think as an architect you would say to build a good architecture of quality, you have to be a sophisticated architect. to add the images, you have to be very sophisticated about the images too. There's a bit of mixing of, but why, there's no rules about that either. Why not do that? And it has been done before in the history of architecture. Particularly constructivist architecture of Russia in the revolutionary period made a lot of use of visual signage as an integral part of the meaning structure of the building itself. So there's no reason why architects couldn't actually, with the formal structures of architecture, like spaces that people have to move in and function as well in, for them to also carry what you call sign meanings or signifying elements, without it being kind of trashy like a lot of postmodern architecture, to my view, has. I'm a real modernist, a postmodern modernist, you might say.
But in a way, you're saying that, or you keep on repeating that, you said these kind of rebellions are artists, as opposed to architecture, that needs to provide spaces to live in. It's kind of difficult to create a space that actually make a critique about our everyday life. Maybe it is possible,
Yeah.
it could be interesting to make something like that.
Yeah, I guess I've never, I've done my research in political thinking, and like many of my generation, have come to something of a dead end, while still maintaining a little bit of a certain utopian idealism about the possibility of redemption in political life. As we move on, the dead end seems to be closer and closer. But
Open up to something new.
well, that's it. That's it. There's other ways of doing things.
The work is remarkably syncretic, isn't it? You want it all ways, don't you? You've got cinematic sequence,
Yeah.
you've got the detail of photography, you've got the presence of modernist painting, you've got the use of architectural space, the way that your work commands architectural space.
The spectacle space in the installation. Yeah.
So, cinema, photography,
Yeah.
modernist painting,
Yeah.
and architecture.
Is that a problem, do you think?
No, I'm just saying.
Yeah. It's a difficult one to.
Erotic.
Well, one thing I see in many artists, often for career ends, and not always, and it's not a fixed judgment, but it's very easy to kind of lock onto a style that the signature styles like Daniel Buren or something you identified with, and just flog that style to death through your career. I prefer to kind of be more mobile, more open, and kind of flow and follow where my real interests lie and where my real abilities lie. Sometimes I have to, I take my work in a direction where I feel like I'm kind of I'm not really good at that. It's not my natural ability, so I withdraw a little bit from it after some period of experiment, and then go in another direction to see where I can go. But you're right, I try to make the work be read on many different levels at once. That's the way I think of it anyways. I think of the work in many different levels at once, including a philosophic level. There's a bit of dilettante, wannabe philosopher approach to it, but I don't know why not. I think philosophy should be enfolded, as a discourse in everybody's everyday life, whether they're professional, capable philosophers or not. I think, Cracker Barrel philosophers, why not? Is so that people think about things. It's really relevant to where you make your claims about significance. If you're making claims of significance for something that's essentially failed or unachieved, then it becomes pretentious. So I have to be always very, very careful that I'm not making certain claims about the work that I see as being pretentious. And I already built in my little metacritical apology in there for using people like Barnett Newman, Don Judd, who I think are artists that have proven themselves many times over. As old as I am, and after 35 years of experience, I still feel like a young artist still trying to prove myself. And why not? Keeps me on my toes. And I've still got the work that needs to be done yet still to do. And maybe I'll get focused one of these days.
Actually, going back to, should I? Yeah?
Sure. Yeah.
And going back to what you were saying before, being philosophical about the artwork, which actually made me think, while we were looking at the slides, I was thinking it's so much what we're talking here at the AA, about delay space, about so many readings into that, which which is very much about contemporary architecture. I'm doing the link now because what Gino was saying
Right.
before, which says a lot about our life. It's about if it's about a building that is getting built, or maybe it's just decaying, or the picture that is it slides into two, and the space between them is space of our thinking, or picture of the world which is delayed in time, the same space. Time and space, which is a very big issue.
Right. I think the breakdown of various genres in the art world, the breakdown of the, well, in my work especially, the breakdown of the borders between photography and painting, for instance, by unfolding one onto the other, unfolds, like say, draws from various discourses and folds one into the other. And I've written, for instance, an article called Photoconceptualism. Everybody's still trying to look at, figure out what to call a certain practice of photography. I call it photoconceptualism. That is, photography that's not so much concerned with respecting the medium per se, but using the medium to carry out a body of ideas, while at the same time also, back to the formal question, of respecting the nature of the medium itself, like what it can do to say something about a certain idea. Every medium has its limits as to what it can say. I've been thinking about the concept of conceptual painting, for instance, of painting now not being about subjective gesturing, in other words, leaving a trace of the self on the surface, but about questioning the nature of what is the painting, in effect, and using that to open up a discourse about, a new kind of discourse about painting. That's not new, by the way. I mean, starting from Ankawara on, there's lots of that. In fact, I think even maybe my own work can be seen in those terms. To bring it back to architecture, why not conceptual architecture? Why architecture as a practice isn't and has never been just about doing beautiful buildings or, getting the right contract or figuring out what the next style is going to be, but it's about all the creative possibilities of what it is to be able to create three-dimensional space that people move and use, and also harmonize with the total environment or run into conflict purposely with the overall environment, like a lot of deconstructivist architecture does or tries to do, including how we now can relook at certain kinds of non-architecture in the language in terms of architecture. Everything from vernacular architecture to telephone and transmission poles is a kind of a vocabulary of architecture that informs our space. And airports, for instance, all kinds of things that we don't normally think of the tarmac of an airport as an architectural space in which modules of airplanes containing people move around on as a kind of a fluid, kind of dynamic mobile architecture, et cetera, et cetera. You can go on and on and on, but there's no reason why architecture can't be thought of somewhat in those terms and opening up the discourse of architecture from that. And it's being done. I mean, I'm not proposing anything new. That is being done in many different directions. I haven't, you might inform me, I haven't seen anything that specifically attempts to identify that in the terms I just put it in the practice of architecture. But I can very much imagine it's happening. And I do see it happening in various exhibitions like Documenta, where there is a bit of some crossover between the architectural discourse and art discourse, and in certain installation concepts, et cetera, by architects.
The Bilbao Museum, I think, is one of the biggest ones.
The what?
The Bilbao Museum.
Yes, of course, Frank Gehry, yeah, exactly. He actually is an architect that really is also practices as an artist. And of course, he's one of the people that began to make sign. He did some bad postmodern architecture too, putting the sign image on the building as a kind of an attachment. In LA, there's some of the buildings of his are like that. But that is an excellent example of that, as a matter of fact. Sorry, you had another.
I was just going to say, an instance of that cross collaboration, quite a successful one, might be the Warsaw Museum in Old England, where the artist Richard Wentworth has done precisely the sort of installation to work with the tarmac against the built fabric in the museum itself. So I think there are many instances of this cross.
Yeah.
But there is also a question of who makes the master narrative.
Right.
There's the subjects there as well.
Yeah. I'm not so interested, except in saying, I'm contradicting myself because I did bring up the instance of Boyd Stroley. of adding the photographic images to the lit windows of the building so it's lit from inside. But I'm not so interested in artists doing things to attach to the building, the classic turd in the plaza, as they call it, as in the architecture itself actually reflecting a conceptual discourse about how we use architectural space. I mean, kind of architectural space that makes us think about what this architectural space actually means. But there I'm making a logical, John will probably catch me as a logical problem, that the meaning, as though I'm assuming that the meaning is separate from the space itself. In my aesthetic, I try to make it so that the meaning is actually the experience of the tangible and material body of the work itself in its syncretic sense. It's all of it. Yeah.
Because it's always moving, it's always changing. And when you understand that, it's like, so you can never catch the moment as you can do without.
Well, you're thinking of architecture as a time-based art there, like music perhaps, or drama.
Yeah, but you can never
That's-
control because it's always evolved. It's because of the sun, it's because of the light inside, it's because of the
Yeah.
light program within it.
I regularly visit architectural spaces, though, certain spaces, certain places, some of them great monuments of architecture, like the Rotunda of Palladio or something like that, and they're still there 500 years later. So
Yeah, well,
they're not necessarily, yeah,
whatever is
yeah,
feeling also, but
yeah,
architecture, we try to
yeah,
define, redefine,
yeah.
redefine.
Well, that's a,
Very good.
so I don't know. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you, and the questions.
Thank you, Wallace, for